Hello everyone, today we're going to talk about if when we are reading our Bible in Genesis 1, are we supposed to take what is said as something literal as it relates to science, or are we interpreting the Bible wrongly, by doing this? We're going to dive into Proposition 1 in this book, The Lost World of Genesis 1, Ancient Cosmology and the Origins Debate by John H. Walton. This is part 3 of my Genesis Bible study. So I have a few questions. I have some thoughts that I would like to share with you what I read about this topic. To begin, it says Proposition 1, Genesis 1 is ancient cosmology. I'll be reviewing a little bit, like sharing about what we learned in the other chapters in case this is your first time watching one of these videos. But pretty much we start off by reading this claim that Walton is making. He's saying Genesis 1, the first chapter in the first book of the Bible, Genesis, it's what we should consider ancient cosmology. And he says that, we're on page 14. It says it does not attempt, Genesis 1 does not attempt to describe cosmology in modern terms or address modern questions. These pages in this section, I want to say chapter 1, but it's actually a book with many propositions. So instead of chapter 1, we call it Proposition 1. So that's the proposition. And I found it very, very informative and challenging at the same time. And I hope that if you hear something that you're like, not sure about that, I hope you will give it a chance and listen to the whole description of this proposition, because you might be a little guarded in what you're hearing, because it might challenge the way that you have heard the Bible described, or maybe you find yourself doing some of these things, and it's going to take, a shift of our minds to do better. So here we go. When we're thinking about the Israelites in Genesis, we have to realize that they did not have all of the scientific advancements that we have. I like to think of it, and I believe this is true, that God created people with intelligence, with creativity, and so it's because of God, the way He designed us, that we are able to make progress in our understanding of science and in our understanding of how the world functions, how He created this world to function. And Israelites, when Genesis 1 was being written and taught, communicated, they did not have the information that we have today. So that's something that you need to be just constantly aware of as we talk about this. So I'll be reading some of the things that I underlined here, and I'll hope to do this quickly. All right. They believed, here are some things that the Israelites believed. They believed that the sky was material, not vaporous, solid enough to support the residence of deity as well as to hold back waters. In these ways and many others, they thought about the cosmos in much the same way that anyone in the ancient world thought, and not at all like anyone thinks today. And God did not think it important to revise their thinking. Have you ever find yourself reading, for example, Psalms, or just in the Old Testament, and it's interesting reading from our modern perspective, because I personally have found myself like, what are they talking about? Even in Genesis, when I read Genesis 1 the other day, whenever I've read it, it's kind of like, what exactly are they talking about as they're describing, you know, the creation of the world? What about the waters? What about how was there light if God had not created the sun just yet on these days? And probably we'll get to that on the other, what are they called, propositions. So yes, I agree. It's like there, for the modern reader, with what we bring to the text of the Bible, like we have our understanding of science, and so when we're reading certain things, it's like, well, it's not really describing the way we understand, you know, the world to function these days. So it's kind of like, well, what do we do about that, you know? Briefly, I just want to mention, it's really cool how I somehow ended up getting this book because it's so perfect. I want to start studying Genesis, but there's just so much in the first chapter, and what an awesome find to be able to find a book that has it's completely about just the first chapter of Genesis. It's so cool, right? Okay, so even though it's about the first book of Genesis, I think it's going to help us to read all the other books as well, you know. Obviously then you need a proper Bible study for all of them, but this is going to help us in not making the mistakes that we might have made on the other books without this information for this book. So let's continue. God did not think it important to revise their thinking. I think what would have happened if God would have explained what he explained to them in Genesis 1, or just in the Old Testament? What would have happened if he would have explained how the solar system actually functions? I wonder if God thought they wouldn't take him seriously. They would have thought it was crazy. Like maybe they weren't ready for God to reveal these things. Like I feel that God is revealing these things to us through people and all these like space exploration and things like that, through the advancement of technology and science. But perhaps it just wasn't the right time for Israel to have an understanding, such an advanced understanding, that God was like, this is what's important in the world that you live in. So I'm going to not distract you from what's truly important. Here's a new word, concordism. And so there's some Christians that approach the text of Genesis as if it had modern science embedded in it, or it dictates what modern science should look like. If we were to read Genesis 1 and say, okay, well, the Bible is our authority, so whatever this says, science has to be explained in this way. And here Walton is saying that's actually, you're doing it wrong. You're using Genesis in the wrong way. Concordism seeks to give a modern scientific explanation for the details in the text. So this is a clear example of how we would be trying to translate the culture and the text so that it aligns with our modern like worldview. I'm just checking here my notes on the side. God helped them understand him and the world with the information they had or believed. That's pretty much how I would sum up these first pages. And don't try to make Genesis 1 say something it didn't. It's not saying that. Its purpose was not that. So let's just stick to what I feel like that might be a secondary goal. Like someone wants to give a Christian worldview about well, they want an understanding of how the world was created, how the world began, and so they want to go to the chapter in the Bible that's most relevant, which is Genesis. But you have to be careful not to make Genesis say something that it wasn't saying. In this first proposition, there are 3 problems that I noted with concordism. And so the first one I just mentioned, it's like if we take the approach, science must say it this way, the way Genesis described it. It must. Everything that we are discovering in science, we must fit it into this like box, into these words that are found in Genesis 1. And I think that it might hinder some of the scientific understanding within our Christian community, because we are busy trying to, I think there's a quote here. We are trying to like defend the Bible unnecessarily. And so to me, I just had to take a moment and think, okay, what's going on here? Because if you remember, in the first video that I made, I mentioned that when we pick up our Bible, the Bible, we have this concept, and it's a huge deal in the Christian community, that the Bible, especially the Protestant Christian community, that the Bible is the authority of whatever we believe, including the origins of the universe. That is our authority. So here we have one concordism is, in a sense, I believe that's what's going on, aside from bad hermeneutics, bad habits of misinterpreting the Bible. What's at the heart of it probably is that Christians who are saying this is the authority, the Bible is the authority, so science must fit into this because the Bible is our authority. Science can't say something that Genesis doesn't say. But here's the other option that we're hearing from Walton. He's saying because Genesis 1 is authoritative, because of its authority, Scripture, the Bible, we should be that much more careful not to change its meaning, even if we have the best of intentions. All right, moving on to the next authoritative problem is what I wrote here. There are three things that would seem to imply that concordism is not respecting the Bible's authority. First one was, again, that we're changing the meaning. We're trying to translate the culture. In, I think it was video 2, we talked about how the only way to accurately understand what Genesis is teaching us is not just translating the words from its original language to like English, and you can't just translate the culture either, because we will change the meaning of what was intended originally in the context of the original culture. But the best way is to understand the culture and try not to bring our own culture and try to include that as we're learning about Genesis. So yeah, I think that's a brief review. I definitely recommend you go and watch that video, part 2, if you haven't, because he goes really into detail about why we shouldn't do those things. So the next problem is that if we are doing that, trying to make Genesis 1 say something scientifically that it's not trying to say, we are dependent on what's the newest scientific consensus. So if we're like, wait, science, Genesis 1 is saying this scientific truth. But there have been so many different views of what is scientific truth. I'm not saying that there isn't one, but if we just rewind with the, like, I don't know, thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago, Genesis 1 would be saying something completely different than what Genesis 1 in our mind is saying today. So that would be an error also. We're stretching Genesis 1 and trying for it to say something different depending on where you are at in history. And then the third problem is that if we're taking the literal approach, we might miss the main point that God is actually, he's like, this is what's important. And because we're so distracted, oh, we need to make Genesis 1 fit exactly how we understand science today. We're missing the actual point. Like, what was that God actually interested in teaching his people in this chapter? It's not our job to try to reconcile the ancient understanding of cosmology. So those are the 3 things, and so let's rewind a little bit and read through it in the book. If we accept Genesis 1 as ancient cosmology, then we need to interpret it as ancient cosmology rather than translate it into modern cosmology. If we try to turn it into modern cosmology, we are making the text say something that it never said. Okay. So another problem with concordism is that it assumes that the text should be understood in reference to current scientific consensus, which would mean that it would neither correspond to last century's scientific consensus nor to that which may develop in the next century. Here is something I highlighted. What is accepted as true today may not be accepted as true tomorrow, because what science provides is the best explanation of the data at the time. I thought that was a great explanation of the purpose of science. It is, what information do we have today, and what is most reasonable to believe about the universe. And he's going to, in the end of this proposition, he is going to, let's just call them chapters. I keep pausing every single time I'm about to say chapter. We're just going to call them chapters. At the end, he's going to talk about that, how our understanding of science, not including like the supernatural, how that's relevant to this proposition. But yeah, pretty much that's what science is. It's data. And so we gain nothing by bringing God's revelation into accordance with today's science. In contrast, it makes perfect sense that God communicated his revelation to his immediate audience in terms they understood. We have to remember, yes, we are the later audience, but who is God communicating these things at what time in history and why? We can't put ourselves in there like, oh yeah, God was talking to America. No, God was talking to Israel at that time. Okay, page 16. Since God did not deem it necessary to communicate a different way of imagining the world to Israel, but was content for them to retain the native ancient cosmic geography, we can conclude that it was not God's purpose to reveal the details of cosmic geography, defined as the way one thinks about the shape of the cosmos. The shape of the earth, the nature of the sky, the locations of sun, moon, and stars are simply not of significance, and God could communicate what he desired regardless of one's cosmic geography. Concordism tries to figure out how there could have been waters above the sky, Genesis 1:7. Whereas the view proposed here maintains that this terminology is simply describing cosmic geography in Israelite terms to make a totally different point. So we're going to learn about that in the next propositions. So follow along. If you are not a subscriber yet, please subscribe, and let's keep learning more about this topic together. If cosmic geography is culturally descriptive rather than revealed truth, it takes its place among many other biblical examples of culturally relative notions. Okay, this is going into another topic. But here's the way we can understand the book of Genesis. We are reading how the people understood the cosmos at that time. However their understanding was, God's going to reveal himself within that understanding. Here's another example of how their understanding, God used their understanding, even if it's not like our scientific understanding today. God used that understanding in order to teach them how to live for him, how to love him. And again, as a modern reader, when I read these things, I'm like, what? Like, how are we supposed to do that? Like, I don't understand. Am I missing something? What does it mean? And you'll see what I mean right now. So for example, if, let's see, in the ancient world, people believed that the seat of intelligence, emotion, and personhood was in the internal organs, particularly the heart, but also the liver, the kidneys, and intestines. Many Bible translations use the English word mind when the Hebrew text refers to the entrails, showing the ways in which language and culture are interrelated. In modern language, we still refer to the heart metaphorically as the seat of emotion. Like, oh, my heart is breaking, you know? And we touch our heart, we feel it like internally, right? But today we know, well, all of that's going on in your brain. In the ancient world, this was not metaphor, but physiology. This is how they understood the body. Yet we must notice that when God wanted to talk to the Israelites about their intellect, emotions, and will, he did not revise their ideas of physiology and feel compelled to reveal the function of the brain. Instead, he adopted the language of the culture to communicate in terms they understood. The idea that people think with their hearts describes physiology in ancient terms for the communication of other matters. It is not revelation concerning physiology. So when you read about the bowels, or haven't you read certain passages and you're like, what? You think, oh, so it's kind of like, you almost feel like it's incompatible to what you know about physiology, about the human body. So yeah, there is all that like culture information that we're missing. Like, what are we missing today? Why did they write it this way? What did they think? What is their point? How can I love God with, like, how can I love God with my kidney? You know, it just doesn't translate today. So it is important for us to learn, like, okay, this is the point. And this is what their culture understood. But here is the point God was making. So again, he says, consequently, we need not try to come up with a physiology for our times that would explain how people think with their entrails. But a serious concordist would have to do so to save the reputation of the Bible. And I love that. I love how he phrased it, because it's not our job to save the reputation of the Bible necessarily. I feel like a lot of Christian apologists are like, what are you talking about? It is our job. We must demonstrate how the Bible is reliable, etc. That's not the point I'm making. I'm just saying, like, the Bible is tough. You know, it survived many years. And we don't have to feel like we have to force something on the Bible in order to save the Bible, is my point. Concordists believe the Bible must be in accord. That makes sense why it's called concord. What is it called? Concordism, in concord with all the findings of contemporary science. All right. So through the entire Bible, there is not a single instance in which God revealed to Israel a science beyond their own culture. No passage offers a scientific perspective that was not common to the old world science of antiquity. And there's a little note where it takes you to the back and it explains a little bit more that some concordists might say, wait, God did reveal new scientific information to them by suggesting that the world was spherical, that the earth was a sphere. But it's in the back, it says that actually it was described as a disc. So it still stands what he's arguing. He talks about the questions that come up and that he's going to be raising. One of them is there such a thing as a natural world? And he says, before we move on, even before we reach proposition number 2, we must address this one. And here's where I told you about how he's going to talk about science today. There is no concept of a natural world in ancient Near Eastern thinking. The dichotomy between natural and supernatural is a relatively recent one. You know how we separate science and supernatural? That's how we think of things today. But back then, that was not in their mind. So don't bring that to when you're reading Genesis, because they weren't thinking in those terms. The Israelites, along with everyone else in the ancient world, believed instead that every event was the act of deity, that every plant that grew, every baby born, every drop of rain, and every climatic disaster was an act of God. No natural laws governed the cosmos. Deity ran the cosmos or was inherent in it. There were no miracles in the sense of events deviating from that which was natural. There were only signs of the deity's activity, sometimes favorable and sometimes not. So Richard Bube, I think that's how you say his last name, he suggests that if God were to unplug himself in that way from the cosmos, we and everything else in the cosmos would simply cease to exist. There is nothing natural about the world in biblical theology, nor should there be in ours. This does not suggest that God micromanages the world, only that he is thoroughly involved in the operations and functions of the world. So here we have their understanding is that everything is because of deity. And we see this with like false religions, right? Like they would do sacrifices because even rain was thought of as, I need to do something in order to receive rain from whatever deity they believed in. And so when there wasn't rain, they would feel like their deity was angry with them and so forth. He's arguing that just because our understanding and their understanding, Israelites' understanding, is correct, that we shouldn't think of cosmology as something secular, that something that is irrelevant, that God is irrelevant to our understanding of how the world began. He's saying it's not to say that God is behind every tiny, like micromanaging, like, you know, like he caused me to put this cup down. But he's saying that he is still thoroughly involved in the operations and functions of the world. I think what he's saying is in the way that he made the universe to work, like gravity, for example. I would say human will, that I willed it and he allowed the force of gravity to work with me to put this thing down. But also I would say God sustains my life. He decides how long I will be on this earth. So without his blessing me with life, I would not even be able to will it or gravity to work with me to let that happen. Moving on. Notice that even the biblical text merges these perspectives when this is something I brought up, I believe, in part 1. And let's see, I don't want to teach things that are wrong, so let's observe this a little deeper, you know. I'll explain in a little bit. Notice that even the biblical text merges these perspectives when Genesis 1:24 says, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures," but then follows up with the conclusion in the very next verse, "So God made the animals." So I said, well, is God using language, because this isn't just something that an author wrote. describing their culture, their views, God inspired the author with that culture, with those views, but it's still, whatever the author is writing is inspired from God. So I'm wondering if in the process of inspiration, if God allowed the language to allow us in modern times to consider ways that God made this happen. We'll get there, I think, in this book. For example, I guess I'll just say this. God is speaking in Genesis, right? And things are happening. But when he speaks, is there an actual thing that is happening or just poof? You know what I mean? So that was my question pretty much. So let's see, how can I make sure that I'm not being a concordist in my asking questions? When that is written, there is no separation. There is no, for example, if a scientist is going to argue for evolution, you can't get that from Genesis 1:24, because he said, let the earth bring forth, but right away he says, God made the animals. So some people might say, no, it's evolution, it's not God. But Genesis 1 is not saying that. All of these issues are modern issues imposed on the text. Yeah, we are bringing those questions. And I think that's good. We should bring those questions, but we should be careful with our interpreting as we're asking those questions and looking for answers in scripture. So all of these issues are modern issues imposed on the text and not the issues in the culture of the ancient world. Much to our dismay, then, we will find that the text is impervious to many of the questions that consume us in today's dialogues. Though we long for the Bible to weigh in on these issues and give us biblical perspectives or answers, we dare not impose such an obligation on the text. God has chosen the agenda of the text, and we must be content with the wisdom of those choices. God chooses the purpose of Genesis 1, and we have to be okay with that because we trust that he's wise. And the way I see it sometimes, it's like God feels like he doesn't have to tell us everything, you know? He didn't want to answer every one of our questions in the Bible. But isn't it awesome how he has allowed us to learn more about the world? And in a sense, he is answering our questions through the development of scientific advancements. If we attempt to commandeer the text to address our issues, we distort it in the process. So be very respectful of scripture and don't force something. The Bible's message must not be subjected to cultural imperialism. So its message transcends the culture in which it originated. But the form in which the message was embedded was fully permeated by the ancient culture. So no culture can claim the Bible's message. No culture can claim it. The culture is relevant to how it was delivered to that culture, how it was understood by that culture, but it's not to say the culture is the Bible's message. So it goes beyond culture, but culture is relevant. That culture is relevant. This was God's design and we ignore it at our peril. Sound interpretation proceeds from the belief that the divine and human authors were competent communicators. If we believe that God is a competent communicator, that he is very skillful at communicating to us what he wants to communicate, and that the authors were competent as well to write that down, then we have to trust what we are given. But to do so, we must respect the integrity of the author by refraining from replacing his message with our own. Though we cannot expect to be able to think like they thought, or read their minds, or penetrate very deeply into so much that is opaque to us in their culture, we can begin to see that there are other ways of thinking besides our own, and begin to identify some of the ways in which we have been presumptuously ethnocentric. So it's like we're so consumed by what we think that sometimes we need a reality check, and we need to step outside of what we think and step into how someone else thinks, like how they thought, how their culture saw things, the ancient cosmology, how they viewed physiology, and be aware of that as we are reading, and how we're noticing how God wisely chooses to talk to them given their understanding at that time. Okay, and I will end this video by sharing my questions here. And if I had an interview with John Walton, I would probably ask these questions. So I might save them in case there is an interview. I don't know. I have to research him and stuff. So my first question is, did God sneak scientific truth knowing we would read it today with our modern understanding of science? So is there a proper way to go to Genesis 1 and with our understanding of science today and ask the question, for example, like, did God mean to use that language about God said, let the earth produce? Did God purposely leave that like that because he was thinking about us in the future? Because he knew that we would have these questions of science? Go ahead and leave your answers in the bottom if you would like to give it a shot. 2. My next question is, did God teach? And I ask these questions with reverence and in the safety of knowing that God allows us to ask questions about him, and that he's so good that he will bring us information when we are honestly seeking his truth, when we are honestly seeking him and we are faithful to him. So did God teach indirectly wrong things about science? And that question, I'm already certain that it's a no, because God would not teach us anything that goes against his character, which is that he is the truth. Even Jesus said he is the truth, you know, and that the enemy is the one that deceives, that there is no truth in him. So that question, you know, my question is more like, it's lacking, I'm lacking knowledge about, was there anything that the Israelites believed that God just kind of went along with it? You know what I mean? That's what I don't know. It's like, okay, what are the passages in the Bible? For example, that God stopped the sun. I think there's a passage that skeptics have raised to say, oh, you know, Christianity is not reliable. So I'm curious to see how God responds to things that we would say, oh, you're saying it wrong, or you don't understand how the world works. And my last question is, what is the relationship between Genesis 1 and our scientific understanding as it relates to considering his existence through science? So like, for example, when there are Christian apologists that want to give evidence in favor of the existence of God, and so there are these scientific debates that happen. Like, how can we go ahead and do that using Genesis 1? You know, is what and I'm pretty sure he's going to answer these questions in the next chapters. So my question is, what if the Israelites' understanding of cosmology have wrong things, right? Do they have, what are the things that we can see, we have discovered through science that we're like, whoa, the Israelites had this, in their understanding, even if it was limited, they didn't have the information to believe these things, but they still believe this. What are those things? And what are the things that, now that we've, you know, learned new things, what are the things that they had wrong? And is it still possible to use Genesis 1, for example, to make arguments in favor of God's existence through the use of Genesis? It's kind of, I guess I need to work on that question a little more, but I'm pretty sure we're going to get the answers to these questions as we learn more about Genesis 1. So thank you so much for watching this video. I recommend you buy this book. So far, so good. And I think you agree that it's a book that you can understand even if you're not, you know, the most, the reader of the world, you know, like the best reader in the world. Yeah. Thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. If you haven't already, please sign up for my newsletter. I'll be sending one out pretty soon at the end of every month, but this month we're doing it at the beginning of this month. And I think my cat wants to say hello. No, she doesn't. Hi, Mama. Hi, sweetheart. Anyways, go to susanmorales.org to sign up for that. And if you're interested in supporting what I do, helping me make the payments that go towards this YouTube channel and website, please become a Patreon. You can find that under the support tag in the menus in my website. And what else? Leave me a like and give me a share so that more people can join our Bible study on Genesis. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.